The year is 1941. A warehouse sits in the industrial district of occupied Lyon, France. German soldiers patrol the perimeter with practiced efficiency. Inside, machinery hums with the rhythm of Nazi war production. Ball bearings, tank components, the mundane materials that fuel conquest. A Wehrmacht private walks through the storage area conducting his nightly inspection. His boots echo on concrete floors. In the corner, near a pile of coal destined for the building's boiler, he notices something. A dead rat. He wrinkles his nose in disgust and kicks it aside with his boot. Just another vermin casualty in a city under occupation. He doesn't know that inside that rat is enough plastic explosive to reduce this entire facility to rubble. He doesn't know that 50 more are hidden in warehouses, factories, and supply depots across occupied Europe. He doesn't know that in 6 hours, when a worker shovels that rat into the furnace along with the morning coal, this building will cease to exist. And he certainly doesn't know about the man who created this weapon. A former stage magician turned military inventor. A man the Germans would come to call the Sabotage sorcerer. A man who understood that the most dangerous weapon isn't always the one that kills the most people. Sometimes, it's the one that makes an entire army afraid of dead rats in a coal pile. This is the story of how one engineer's insane idea changed the nature of sabotage warfare forever. This is the story of the exploding rats of World War II. June 1940. France has fallen. The swastika flies over Paris. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all their heavy equipment on French beaches. Britain stands alone against the Nazi war machine. The situation is desperate. Invasion seems inevitable. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, knows that conventional military responses are insufficient. Britain lacks the manpower, the equipment, the resources to confront Germany head-on. What Britain needs is something different, something unconventional, something ungentlemanly. On July 22, 1940, Churchill issues a directive that will change the nature of warfare. He calls for the creation of an organization to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, subversion, and irregular warfare. This organization will become known as the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. His official mandate is deceptively simple. Conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe. Support local resistance movements. Disrupt German military operations through any means necessary. The unofficial mandate is even simpler. Do whatever it takes to make the Nazis' lives miserable. But there's a problem. A significant problem that becomes apparent almost immediately. The resistance fighters in occupied territories face an impossible challenge. How do you destroy a German facility when you're operating under constant surveillance? How do you place explosives in a target location when collaborators watch every move? How do you sabotage critical infrastructure when the penalty for possession of explosives is immediate execution? Traditional demolition requires time, access, and expertise. Resistance fighters have none of these luxuries. They need something completely different. The SOE establishes a secret research facility in a requisitioned country estate outside London. The official designation is Station 9, though everyone simply calls it Churchill's Toy Shop. This is where British ingenuity meets wartime necessity. This is where conventional thinking goes to die. The mission statement posted in the workshop is refreshingly blunt. Develop devices and methods to help agents and resistance fighters kill Germans and destroy German property. No idea is too outlandish. No concept is too bizarre. If it might work, build it. The leadership of Station 9 understands something fundamental about clandestine warfare. The best sabotage device isn't necessarily the most powerful. It's the one the enemy never suspects until it's too late. It's the one that can pass through security checkpoints without raising alarm. It's the one that resistance fighters can deploy without specialized training. And ideally, it's the one that creates psychological impact far beyond its actual destructive capacity. Enter Major Christopher Clayton Hutton. Though if you had met him before the war, you would have known him by his stage name, Clutty. Hutton's background is decidedly non-military. He worked as a journalist, an inventor, and most famously, as a stage magician specializing in escape artistry. His pre-war claim to fame involved elaborate illusions and seemingly impossible escapes from locked containers. He understood misdirection. He understood how to hide objects in plain sight. He understood that the human mind sees what it expects to see and dismisses what seems mundane or out of place. When war broke out, Hutton's unique skill set caught the attention of military intelligence. He was recruited into MI9, the British military intelligence section responsible for helping prisoners of war escape. His job was to create escape aids that could be smuggled into POW camps. Maps hidden inside playing cards. Compasses concealed in uniform buttons. Saws embedded in shoelaces. He became legendary for his ability to hide contraband in objects that would pass even the most thorough German inspections. By 1941, Hutton had been transferred to Station 9 with a new mandate. Apply the same principles to sabotage. Create devices that German security forces would never recognize as weapons. Make the familiar dangerous. Turn the everyday into the deadly. His philosophy was simple, and he repeated it constantly to his engineering team. The best weapon is one the enemy never sees coming. The most effective bomb is the one that sits in plain sight until the moment of detonation. The team at Station 9 began brainstorming. What objects exist in every German-occupied facility? What items are so common, so mundane, that guards would never think to search them? What could be transported, placed, and abandoned without arousing suspicion? The ideas came in rapid succession. Lumps of coal. Everyone heats with coal. Coal piles exist in every factory, every warehouse, every military installation. Wine bottles. The Germans requisitioned French wine by the thousands of cases. Fountain pens. Officers carry them constantly. Flashlight batteries. Essential equipment for any military force. But Hutton pushed further. He wanted something with psychological impact. Something that would create lasting paranoia even after the initial attacks. One evening, during a brainstorming session in the workshop, someone made an offhand comment. What about dead animals? Every building has dead mice or rats. Pest control is a constant battle in warehouses and factories. Guards see dead rodents daily and think nothing of them. The room fell silent. Everyone recognized the brilliance immediately. A dead rat in a coal pile wouldn't just go unnoticed. It would be actively avoided. No one wants to handle a dead rat. No one examines a dead rat closely. Dead rats are not only ignored, they're instinctively repulsive. People kick them aside and forget about them immediately. Hutton leaned back in his chair and smiled. That misdirection smile that had served him so well on stage. The smile that meant he'd just figured out how to make the impossible possible. He stood up and addressed his team with absolute conviction. Gentlemen, he said, we're going to weaponize vermin. And when we're done, the Germans are going to be more afraid of dead rats than they are of our bombers. The team got to work immediately, but creating an explosive rat was far more complicated than simply hollowing out a rodent carcass and stuffing it with explosives. This had to be perfect. It had to be undetectable even under relatively close inspection. It had to survive handling, transport, and deployment. It had to be stable enough that resistance fighters could carry them without accidentally detonating. And it had to contain enough explosive material to cause significant damage. The first challenge was procurement. Station 9 needed dead rats. Lots of them. Not just any rats, but large rats that could accommodate a substantial explosive charge. The team contacted London's pest control services and municipal sanitation departments. Within days, Station 9 was receiving regular deliveries of rat carcasses from all over London. The workshop began to smell like a particularly unsuccessful taxidermy operation. But the engineers persevered. The technical specifications were demanding. Each rat needed to be carefully prepared to maintain its natural appearance while serving as a delivery vehicle for high explosives. The process began with preservation. The rat carcasses were treated with chemicals to prevent decomposition and eliminate the worst of the smell. This was crucial because the devices needed to remain stable for weeks or potentially months before deployment. A rotting rat would draw attention. A well-preserved rat could sit in a coal pile indefinitely. Next came the surgical phase. Using scalpels and precision instruments, technicians made careful incisions along the rat's abdomen. The internal organs were removed and the body cavity was thoroughly cleaned. This created the space necessary for the explosive charge. But maintaining the rat's external appearance was critical. The incisions had to be minimal and the subsequent stitching had to be nearly invisible. The team employed techniques borrowed from professional taxidermists, using fine surgical thread and careful suturing that followed the rat's natural fur patterns. The explosive material selected was Nobel 808, a plastic explosive that was stable, powerful, and relatively safe to handle. Each rat was carefully packed with approximately 100 grams of the compound. This might not sound like much, but 100 grams of plastic explosive properly placed can destroy a large boiler, rupture a fuel tank, or demolish a small building's structural supports. The explosive was shaped and compressed to fit the rat's body cavity, maintaining the natural contours and weight distribution of an actual rat carcass. The detonation mechanism presented the most significant engineering challenge. It had to be reliable, relatively foolproof, and activated by the most likely method of disposal. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. A pressure-sensitive detonator was embedded within the explosive charge. The device was calibrated to trigger when subjected to the intense heat and pressure of a furnace or boiler. When a worker shoveled the rat along with coal into a boiler, the rising temperature would activate the detonator. The explosion would occur minutes later, after the worker had moved away, ensuring the sabotage appeared to be a boiler malfunction rather than deliberate attack. Some versions included time delay fuses for situations where heat activation was unlikely. These used chemical fuses that dissolved slowly when exposed to moisture or specific temperatures, allowing for detonation hours or even days after placement. The variety of detonation methods made the weapons adaptable to different target scenarios and increased the psychological uncertainty for German security forces. Once packed with explosives, the rat was carefully sewn shut. This is where the attention to detail became crucial. The stitching had to be nearly invisible, following natural fur lines and body contours. The preserved skin was pliable enough to allow realistic appearance but firm enough to contain the explosive securely. The finished product looked, at casual glance, exactly like a dead rat that had been lying around a warehouse or factory floor for a few days. The weight felt right. The texture appeared natural. Even the posture of death was carefully arranged to look authentic. Quality control was obsessive. Each rat bomb was inspected by multiple technicians. They were dropped from various heights to ensure the detonators wouldn't trigger prematurely. They were subjected to temperature variations. They were handled roughly to simulate transport conditions. Any device that showed signs of damage or instability was dismantled and rebuilt. The failure rate had to be essentially zero because a prematurely detonating rat bomb would not only fail to damage German infrastructure, it would alert the Germans to the entire program. The completed devices were packaged for shipment with remarkable attention to detail. They weren't packed in military crates or containers that might suggest their true nature if intercepted. Instead, they were placed in ordinary boxes and labeled with innocuous designations. Some shipments were marked as sanitation supplies. Others were labeled as scientific specimens. The packaging ensured that even if a container was opened during transit, the contents would appear mundane. Documentation was minimal by design. No written instructions accompanied the rat bombs initially. Resistance networks received verbal briefings from SOE agents about deployment methods. The training was simple enough that it could be memorized and didn't require written manuals that might be discovered during Gestapo raids. Place the rat near fuel sources, especially coal piles. Make the placement look natural, as if the rat died there. Then leave. The explosion will handle the rest. But Hutton and his team understood something that elevated this weapon beyond simple sabotage. The rat bomb's greatest power wasn't its explosive capacity. It was its psychological impact. The device was designed from the beginning to create fear and paranoia that would far exceed its actual destructive effect. This wasn't just about destroying German infrastructure. This was about getting inside the enemy's head. The psychological warfare aspect was carefully considered. Once the Germans discovered even a single rat bomb, their security protocols would have to change dramatically. Every dead rat in every facility across occupied Europe would become a potential threat. Soldiers and workers would have to examine every rodent carcass they encountered. Security sweeps would expand to include pest control as a counterintelligence measure. Man-hours would be diverted from productive military activity to hunting for weaponized vermin. Even better, the paranoia would be self-perpetuating. The Germans wouldn't know how many rat bombs had been deployed. For every one they found, they would imagine dozens or hundreds more lurking undiscovered. Every unexplained boiler explosion, every mysterious fire, every industrial accident would be attributed to sabotage. The uncertainty would be maddening. And uncertainty is the enemy of efficient military operations. Station 9 produced approximately 50 rat bombs in the initial production run. Each device represented hours of meticulous engineering and preparation. But 50 devices were never meant to destroy 50 targets. They were meant to compromise thousands of targets psychologically. They were meant to turn every German facility in occupied Europe into a potential crime scene. They were meant to make the occupiers feel that nowhere was safe, that anything could be a weapon, that the everyday mundane world had turned hostile. The distribution network was already in place. The SOE had spent months establishing lines of communication with resistance networks across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway. These networks had proven capable of receiving supply drops, maintaining security, and executing sabotage operations with increasing sophistication. The rat bombs would be delivered via the same channels that brought weapons, explosives, and radio equipment to resistance fighters. The first shipment was prepared in early 1941. 20 rat bombs packed in a nondescript container. The drop zone was in rural France, far from German patrols, where a resistance cell had established a secure reception area. The RAF bombers that conducted supply drops had become adept at precision delivery, parachuting containers to within a few hundred meters of designated coordinates. On a moonless night in March, a Halifax bomber crossed the French coast at low altitude. The cargo bay doors opened. The container tumbled into the darkness, parachute deploying. Minutes later, French resistance fighters were loading the package onto a farm cart and disappearing into the countryside. The resistance cell that received the first shipment of rat bombs consisted of 17 men and women operating in the industrial region north of Lyon. They were factory workers, farmers, a schoolteacher, a mechanic. Ordinary people who had chosen to fight back against occupation in whatever ways they could. Most had never handled explosives before joining the resistance. The rat bombs were perfect for their skill level and operational security situation. The cell leader, a man known only by his codename Renard, examined the devices with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The British had sent them dead rats packed with explosives. It was so absurd it had to work. He divided the rat bombs among his team members, each receiving 2 or 3 devices. The instructions were clear. Identify targets of opportunity. German-controlled factories, warehouses, supply depots, any facility critical to the occupation. Scout the location. Determine where coal is stored. Find an opportunity to place the rat naturally in or near the coal pile. Then leave and let the device do its work. The first deployment happened within 48 hours. A resistance fighter who worked as a maintenance man at a ball bearing factory had perfect access. He arrived for his shift carrying his lunch pail and thermos like always. Inside his coat pocket, wrapped in newspaper, was a rat bomb. During his morning rounds, he passed through the boiler room. The coal pile sat in the corner, tons of black fuel waiting to feed the furnaces that powered the factory's machinery. He glanced around. The boiler operator had stepped outside for a cigarette. The maintenance man reached into his coat, pulled out the rat, and tossed it onto the coal pile near the base. The rat settled naturally among the lumps of coal, looking exactly like what it appeared to be. Just another dead rat in an industrial facility. The maintenance man completed his rounds and left at the end of his shift. He went home. He ate dinner with his family. He gave no indication that anything unusual had happened. He certainly didn't know if the device would work or when it might detonate. That was the beauty and the terror of the operation. Once placed, the rat bomb became entirely autonomous. Its detonation depended on factors beyond anyone's control. Would it be shoveled into the furnace tomorrow? Next week? Never? 3 days later, at 6:47 in the morning, the factory's number 2 boiler exploded with devastating force. The blast tore through the boiler room, ruptured steam pipes, and started fires that spread to the factory floor. 3 workers died in the initial explosion. 17 more were injured. But the real damage was the destruction of the factory's heating and power systems. The facility would be offline for at least 8 weeks while repairs were completed. 8 weeks of lost production. 8 weeks of ball bearings that wouldn't reach German tanks and aircraft. 8 weeks of disruption to the Nazi war machine. The German investigation was immediate and thorough. Gestapo officers, military intelligence, and industrial safety inspectors descended on the factory. They interviewed survivors. They examined the wreckage. They searched for evidence of sabotage. But boiler explosions, while tragic, were not uncommon in industrial facilities operating at maximum capacity with minimal maintenance. Boilers were pushed beyond their rated specifications. Safety inspections were cursory. Equipment was aging and inadequately maintained. The investigators concluded that the explosion was an unfortunate accident caused by excessive steam pressure and poor maintenance protocols. The resistance cell celebrated quietly. They had no definitive proof that their rat bomb had caused the explosion. But the timing was right. The location was right. And whether the explosion was their device or simply a fortunate coincidence, a German facility was destroyed. They prepared to deploy more devices. Over the following months, rat bombs were placed in factories across occupied France. Some detonated. Some were discovered before deployment. Some were never heard from again, possibly sitting undiscovered in coal piles or destroyed when the facilities were bombed by Allied aircraft. The beauty of the program was that exact accounting didn't matter. Success wasn't measured by a body count or a tally of destroyed facilities. Success was measured by German reaction. And the German reaction was everything Hutton and Station 9 had hoped for and more. In June 1941, German counterintelligence scored what they believed was a significant victory. During a raid on a resistance safe house in Brussels, they discovered 2 intact rat bombs. The devices were immediately sent to Berlin for analysis. German engineers carefully dissected the weapons, documenting every detail. They were impressed despite themselves. The construction was sophisticated. The camouflage was nearly perfect. The detonation mechanism was simple yet reliable. But that analysis, that moment of discovering the rat bombs, triggered exactly the psychological cascade that the British had engineered. The Germans now knew that the British were deploying explosive devices disguised as dead rats. But they didn't know how many had been deployed. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know when they had started appearing or when they might stop. Every unexplained explosion at a German facility became potentially attributable to sabotage. Every dead rat became a potential threat. Security protocols were immediately revised across occupied territories. New directives came from Berlin. All personnel must be alert for suspicious objects, particularly dead animals found near fuel sources. Dead rats discovered in industrial facilities must be carefully examined before disposal. If any suspicion exists, explosives disposal teams must be contacted. In particularly sensitive facilities, dead animals must be removed by trained personnel using proper safety protocols and X-rayed before disposal. The paranoia spread quickly through German military and industrial infrastructure. Factory supervisors held meetings warning workers about explosive rats. Security forces conducted sweeps looking for planted devices. Posters appeared in German-controlled facilities showing images of the rat bombs and warning about British sabotage techniques. The images were accompanied by stern warnings and instructions for reporting suspicious objects. Christopher Clayton Hutton continued his work with Station 9 and MI9 throughout the war. The rat bomb was just one of dozens of ingenious devices he helped develop. His workshop produced escape maps printed on silk that could be hidden in uniform linings. Compasses small enough to be concealed inside uniform buttons or collar stays. Saws that could be hidden in shoelaces or bootlaces. Miniature cameras disguised as cigarette lighters. Every device reflected Hutton's fundamental philosophy. Hide the extraordinary in the ordinary. Make the familiar dangerous. Use the enemy's expectations against them. His work with escape and evasion equipment proved particularly valuable. Thousands of Allied airmen shot down over occupied Europe used devices designed by Hutton to evade capture or escape from prisoner of war camps. Maps hidden in playing cards helped downed pilots navigate to neutral territory. Compasses concealed in everyday objects guided them across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. The impact was measurable. Hundreds of airmen successfully evaded capture or escaped captivity, returning to operational duty thanks in part to Hutton's innovations. But Hutton never achieved the recognition given to other wartime scientists and inventors. His work was classified. The devices he created were secret. The operations that employed his inventions were covert. When the war ended, Hutton returned to civilian life with little public acknowledgement of his contributions. He wrote a book about his wartime experiences, but it was heavily censored by British intelligence. Most of the details, including the rat bombs, remained classified for decades. Hutton died in 1965, largely forgotten outside a small circle of intelligence veterans who understood his contributions. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s, as wartime documents were gradually declassified, that the full scope of his work became public knowledge. Historians discovered the rat bomb program in archived SOE files. Museums acquired surviving examples of his devices. His reputation underwent posthumous rehabilitation as military historians recognized his innovative approach to clandestine warfare. Today, rat bombs are displayed in military museums in London, Washington, and other cities. The devices sit in glass cases, brown and unremarkable, accompanied by placards explaining their purpose and impact. Visitors often react with a mixture of fascination and horror. The idea of weaponizing dead animals strikes modern sensibilities as both brilliantly clever and somewhat disturbing. But placed in historical context, the rat bomb represents a legitimate and remarkably effective form of psychological warfare. The principles that guided the rat bomb's design continue to influence modern military thinking. Asymmetric warfare, the concept of using unconventional methods to combat a superior conventional force, owes much to innovations like Hutton's. Modern insurgencies and resistance movements employ similar psychological tactics, creating ambient uncertainty and forcing occupying forces to expend resources defending against threats both real and imagined. The rat bomb also represents an important lesson in threat perception versus actual threat. The Germans deployed enormous resources to defend against a program that consisted of 50 devices, most of which never functioned as intended. The perception of threat, carefully cultivated through the discovery of a few examples, generated responses far beyond the actual tactical danger. This disproportion between threat and response remains relevant in contemporary security analysis. Organizations and governments continue to struggle with distinguishing between genuine threats requiring substantial resources and minor threats amplified by fear and uncertainty. From a technical perspective, the rat bomb demonstrates the importance of operational security in clandestine operations. The device succeeded because it was nearly impossible to detect before deployment and difficult to defend against once deployed. Modern improvised explosive devices, while far more sophisticated in their electronic components, often employ similar camouflage principles. Hiding explosives in everyday objects, using common materials that don't trigger security measures, exploiting the tendency of security forces to overlook the familiar and mundane. The ethical dimensions of the rat bomb are worth considering. By modern standards, deploying explosive devices in industrial facilities where civilian workers are present raises significant moral questions. The rat bombs killed and injured workers who were often forced laborers or civilians coerced into working for the German war effort. These weren't voluntary participants in Nazi aggression but victims of occupation themselves. The SOE's position was that disrupting German war production justified the risk to civilian lives, especially given the stakes of the conflict. This utilitarian calculation, prioritizing strategic impact over individual safety, reflects the brutal arithmetic of total war. However, compared to strategic bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, the rat bomb program was remarkably targeted and restrained. The devices were placed in industrial and military facilities, not civilian population centers. The explosive charges were small, designed to destroy equipment rather than cause mass casualties. The unintended deaths that occurred were tragic but represented a tiny fraction of the civilian casualties caused by conventional military operations. In the context of World War II's violence, the rat bomb was a precision instrument. The program also highlighted the importance of innovation in warfare. Britain in 1940 and 41 lacked the conventional military strength to confront Germany directly. Innovation became a strategic necessity. The rat bomb, along with hundreds of other SOE devices and operations, represented Britain's attempt to leverage creativity and ingenuity against superior German industrial and military capacity. Small teams of inventors and engineers, given freedom to pursue unconventional ideas, produced weapons and tactics that had strategic impact far beyond their modest resource requirements. Station 9's approach to development was remarkably modern for its time. The facility operated with minimal bureaucracy, encouraged experimental thinking, and prioritized rapid prototyping over extensive planning. Ideas moved from concept to production in weeks rather than months or years. Failures were accepted as part of the innovation process. The culture encouraged risk-taking and valued creative problem-solving over adherence to established doctrine. This organizational approach, similar to modern startup methodology, enabled Station 9 to produce dozens of unique devices during the war. The rat bomb's legacy extends into popular culture as well. The device has appeared in numerous books, documentaries, and films about World War II espionage and resistance operations. It's become symbolic of the ingenuity and desperation of the period, representing both the creativity of Allied intelligence services and the brutal pragmatism of clandestine warfare. The image of an explosive rat has a dark comedy to it that captures something essential about the absurdity of war and the strange innovations it produces. For Hutton personally, the rat bomb represented the culmination of his pre-war experience as a magician and his wartime role as an intelligence operative. His entire career, both on stage and in clandestine service, was built on the principle of misdirection. Make the audience look where you want them to look. Hide the truth in plain sight. Use expectations against the observer. The rat bomb was perhaps his greatest illusion, a weapon that looked like trash, a threat that appeared as something utterly mundane, a bomb that people would instinctively avoid rather than examine. The technical documentation of the rat bomb program, now declassified and available in British and American archives, provides fascinating insight into the development process. Engineers' notes describe experiments with different explosive compositions, debates about detonation mechanisms, discussions of packaging and distribution challenges. The files reveal a professional, systematic approach to creating a device that seemed absurd on its surface but required careful engineering and planning to implement successfully. One particularly interesting aspect of the archival material is the feedback from resistance networks after the program was revealed to German intelligence. Several reports noted that German security forces became less effective at identifying actual resistance activities because they were distracted by sabotage concerns. The rat bomb program, by creating ambient paranoia about hidden threats, actually made it easier for resistance networks to conduct other operations. German security was looking for explosive rats when they should have been looking for radio transmitters and weapons caches. The program also demonstrated the value of simplicity in clandestine operations. The rat bomb required minimal training to deploy. Resistance fighters didn't need technical expertise or extensive preparation. The device was essentially foolproof. Place it and leave. This simplicity meant that operatives with varying skill levels could participate effectively. Complex operations requiring technical sophistication are vulnerable to errors and compromise. Simple operations are more robust and scalable. Modern military museums that display rat bombs often include interactive elements allowing visitors to understand the device's construction and operation. Cross-sections show the internal explosive charge and detonation mechanism. Videos explain the historical context and operational impact. These educational displays serve an important function, preserving knowledge of a unique period in military history when innovation and desperation combined to produce remarkable and often bizarre innovations. The rat bomb also raises interesting questions about the nature of weapons and warfare. At what point does an object become a weapon? The rats themselves were not weapons. The explosives inside them were weapons. But the combination, the camouflage, the psychological impact, all these elements together created something more than the sum of its parts. The rat bomb was simultaneously an explosive device, a psychological warfare tool, and a piece of tactical theater designed to manipulate enemy behavior. Contemporary discussions of hybrid warfare and asymmetric conflict often reference historical examples like the rat bomb to illustrate enduring principles. Small investments in unconventional capabilities can generate disproportionate impacts. Psychological effects can be more valuable than physical destruction. The enemy's perception of threat is as important as the actual threat. These lessons, learned through programs like Station 9's Rat Bomb Project, remain relevant to military planners and strategists today. The story of the exploding rats ultimately illustrates something profound about human conflict and creativity. When confronted with overwhelming conventional power, humans innovate. They find unconventional solutions. They weaponize the ordinary. They turn the enemy's strength into weakness through cleverness and misdirection. The rat bomb wasn't the weapon that won World War II. No single device or tactic won that conflict. But it represented an approach to warfare that helped Britain survive its darkest period and eventually emerge victorious. Christopher Clayton Hutton, the magician turned saboteur, understood something that military planners sometimes forget. War is as much about psychology as physics. The bomb that destroys a factory is valuable. But the bomb that makes the enemy afraid of every dead rat in Europe is priceless. The explosion that kills a dozen workers disrupts one facility. The paranoia that diverts 50,000 soldiers to hunting for explosive vermin disrupts an entire occupation. In the end, the rat bomb succeeded not because it was the most powerful weapon or the most sophisticated device. It succeeded because it understood human nature. It exploited instinct and expectation. It turned revulsion and caution into strategic vulnerabilities. It made the familiar terrifying and the mundane deadly. That's the true legacy of the exploding rats of World War II. Not the few buildings they destroyed, but the thousands of German soldiers who spent their war afraid of dead animals in coal piles. That's the kind of victory you can't measure in explosions or body counts. That's the victory of one clever engineer who understood that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is an idea. An idea that gets inside the enemy's head and never leaves. The exploding rats are long gone now, either detonated or destroyed or sitting in museum cases as curiosities from a desperate time. But their impact reverberates through military history as a reminder that innovation, creativity, and psychological insight can be as powerful as bombs and bullets. In a world that often measures strength in terms of firepower and industrial capacity, the rat bomb stands as evidence that sometimes the most effective weapon fits in a coat pocket and looks like garbage. This is the story of the exploding rats that terrified Hitler's Reich. A story of innovation and desperation. A story of psychological warfare and unconventional thinking. A story of one magician's solution to an impossible problem. A story that reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones nobody sees coming. Until it's too late.